We left off last week. I began uh, last Sunday and yesterday, actually. Yesterday and last week when we were speaking, I was speaking about Palm Sunday, and that's the time when Jesus, the last week of his life, he comes in, the Holy Week, he comes into Jerusalem, and he's welcomed joyously as many believed he as the Messiah. And he goes through that week, and it ends or culminates, you might say, in two events. One is on Friday, which tradition has it called Good Friday. I've always wondered about that word good. Well, how is it a Good Friday? But certainly a Good Friday. And then on Sunday, the his resurrection from after being crucified on Friday. And so we left off our story last week where he has the Last Supper, and he basically gives that commandment, which I'll remind you of. A new command I give you: love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And so that, you might say, his parting instructions, in the knowledge that the events that were about to unfold that led up to his crucifixion were imminent. And he sends Judas off to do what he needs to do and tells his disciples, I will be with you only a little bit longer, and where I'm going, you cannot follow me. But you will follow me later. And of course, at that point I mentioned, which I'll finish that story, where Peter says, Lord, where you're going, why can't I follow you? I'll lay down my life for you. And Jesus answers him, will you really lay down your life for me? And he makes a prophecy, very truly, I tell you, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. And I'll get to that story in a moment or two. But a series of events then takes place that ultimately leads up to his crucifixion. And I wanted to jump ahead just a little bit, because this element of the crucifixion and eventually, you could say then his resurrection, that raises a certain number of questions. You could say together, and we have to see them together. The crucifixion and the resurrection is, like Swami says in one of his books, he says, together they dramatize the 2 essential conditions for knowing God: the willingness to face, for his sake, any test that comes, and the faith to accept it with love and courage, and knowing that ultimately it's God's love that is forever. This world is transitory. In other words, both of them are affirmations of the faith and courage that's necessary for us to be able to attain liberation. And God asks of us to give everything, not to hold on to anything. And ultimately, this is the spiritual devotee's challenge. It's our destiny to be able to say, God, I give everything to you. I sacrifice everything. And no good thing, as I mentioned last week, is ever attained in life through some sacrifice, a giving up, sacrifice being, in other words, a releasing of those things willingly, not because they're taken from us. You could say that even in Christ's life, his life was taken from him, yes, on one level, but it's also he willingly acquiesced to that destiny. And so you could say it's a very dramatic symbolism here. We must face our tests in life, and I think because Christ came for a particular mission, it was not, he exited in a very memorable fashion, and you could say a painful fashion, and I think to be crucified is just so dramatic. And of course, you could see it, that symbol of the cross is the symbol of Christianity. And oftentimes you see in churches, you see not just the cross, but you see, an image of Jesus Christ on the cross. I've never particularly been attracted to that, because it's sort of but I think many people are. And I think this is you might say, one of the motivating factors of Christianity. And many, many Christians probably worship Good Friday more than they do the resurrection on Easter on Sunday. It's what moves people, and a big thing is made out of Christ's suffering on the cross. And it's a natural rising of compassion, of empathy. And you could internalize that sense of pain that he must felt. And many Christian monastics, they emphasize that and they attune with that to feel that passion. And there's a tradition in many countries, Christian countries, of every Easter time, they put on a play, and they're called passion plays. And passion plays, and they have ancient traditions of centuries of being put on. I know there are some towns, that put on these plays locally in Europe that have go back hundreds and hundreds of years. Every year this play is put on, and citizens of the town take on the role. And it's a great tradition. And people come from all over to participate in those. But it's centered not on the resurrection so much, it's centered on the suffering that Christ goes through on the cross. And even in some Christian countries, I know in the Philippines, it's tradition. Every year there's a few volunteers who volunteer to be, hoisted up on a cross on Good Friday, and to reenact that very tragic ending. So one can meditate upon that and go into that, and it stirs the emotions. And unfortunately, it stirs many emotions. It can stir compassion, yes, but also over the centuries, it stirs anger at those and the people that put him on that cross. And so you could see it's an emotion. Tends to be very emotional in that way. And there are many saints, Saint Teresa Teresa Neumann, not a saint, but Saint Teresa Neumann. I don't think she's a saint, no, yet, or at least recognized as such. Teresa Neumann, and many saints like Padre Pio, they would, in their meditations, they would empathize so closely that the marks of the stigmata of the nails passing through the palm or the wrist, that some people say, appear on their body in the wound in his side, because they're so identified with that, and it's considered a sign of holiness because of that sanctity, because of that. Well, I'm not attracted to that particularly. And I'm not sure inherently is that a holy thing to do. I guess in the sense that if it attunes oneself and develops one's devotion, it's kind of like emulating the tapasya of saints who mortify their body. This is in my mind, my opinion, and that can be seen as a tapasya. And Swamiji said he was not attracted to that at all, but he said, nevertheless, he did have to recognize that it did do. Some people actually brought them power to do that. And I think too much contemplation on that negative side is not healthy, I don't think. There's a movie, Life of Christ, that came out maybe 10, 20 years ago. And I remember watching that, and they dwelled on the scourging of Christ after his trial. He's scourged, whipped with a lash with barbs in it. And they dwelled on that for a long time. And I just couldn't hardly watch that. But it does move people. But anyway, after that raises a second question. Did Christ suffer from all of that? And now this was an interesting thing. And Master said, Well, definitely he must have been able to feel the pain. Yes, he did. And because a man of his stature comes in, a soul of his stature comes in, is of two faces, you might say. There's a divine and there's a human. And if he had risen to a point where he demonstrated that there was no pain, he had no feeling, people would not have been able to relate with that. And particularly, I think, in the Kali Yuga area that he was incarnated in, the necessity to be able to relate to that in a very physical way was important to his message, to gather that attention, to gather certain sympathy. And it also dramatized and made the resurrection that much more powerful in comparison. So you could say they're bookends, and it did demonstrate the necessity to sacrifice and the willingness to sacrifice. Now, it's not always emphasized in the contemplation of suffering that Jesus accepted that. Even mindedly, you might even say, he was willingly allowed that to happen. But yes, Master said, yes, he felt the pain. Suffering, though, is something else. Is suffering necessarily the feeling of pain? Not necessarily. For suffering is something internal. A separation from God is suffering. Being one with God is joy. And Jesus obviously was one with God. He was God incarnate in the sense of the Christ consciousness was alive within him. And so, yes, in one sense, he could have just totally removed himself from the body and just, paid no attention to it. But he didn't demonstrate that. He demonstrated that the scourging had some effect on him, and he stumbled on his way carrying that cross up to the mount where he was to be lifted up. So but that had its purpose also. So you might say, he suffered in that way, but he said on a different level, there's no suffering at all. You're one with God, and you can suffer and choose to do that which you will, which is the mark of a liberated soul. And it reminds me of that story of Paramhansa Yogananda, where that wishing well, many hundreds of pounds of concrete fell on his foot, and Master, reacted momentarily, and he said, let me demonstrate. And he says, I'm going to put my mind in the body and on that level. And immediately his face contorted, and you could see the pain in him. He says, now I'm going to withdraw and put my mind at the point between the eyebrows and the superconscious. And immediately he was in a blissful state. So consequently, a great master has that ability. And so to the degree that one would suffer, it would be suffering for the sake of his message, the sake of his teachings, the sake of the higher duty that Christ came for, to do God's will. Now, before he's crucified, and right after the Last Supper, he goes into what's called the garden, a garden area of that part of Jerusalem, Garden of Gethsemane, and he asks some of his disciples to come with him, and he prays there. And he asks his disciples to stay awake and watch through the night. And he went off by himself and prayed. And again, the disciples, they fall asleep, and Christ comes back to him. Jesus comes back to him and says, wakes them. He says, could you not at least stay awake? And that phrase of this, the spirit is willing, but the body is weak, comes from that, because they kept falling asleep. But during his prayer, he's not sure. You see, or at least it's recorded as such, that he's not quite sure. And he asks God, is this thy will? If it be thy will to let this cup, those events that were going to be unfolding momentarily, if it be thy will, Lord, let this cup pass from me. But if it's thy will be done, Lord, not my own. So he was just asking to make sure, because this was a dramatic event. It was the ending of his worldly mission out in the physical body. And so he wanted to be sure, and he asked, but I think it's a very moving and shows sort of the human divine element. He was saying, Lord, I don't necessarily want, as from my body self, my physical self. The human side certainly doesn't welcome this, is want to do this, certainly not my preference to do this, but the higher duty, and I think he's demonstrating this higher duty. I want to do the higher duty, and it's in a sense for our sake, to show the example of thy will be done, not my own. You let this in. And I think also he must have felt some pain or suffering there because he knew that this would be very painful to others, not just him, but others, his disciples, those who had followed him. They were going to be suffering also through this act. And so he had empathy for them. And that, of course, raises a larger question. Did this, it's said that Jesus was crucified and died for mankind's sins. And Paramhansa Yogananda says, no, that's not so. He didn't die for everybody's sins, but certainly he died for his disciples' sake. In a sense, he took on the karma of his disciples, the karma of those people that were in tune with him. He helped ease their way karmically through this action, the very negative thing that was going to happen to, of which there was no karmic imperative, you might say, for him to be crucified that way. But he took on whatever karma, it was sort of, you could say it was representative of the karma of others that a great master takes on, often in parts, maybe the latter parts of his life, takes on karma to help his disciples go forward. But as Master said, he certainly didn't take on, release everybody of their sins, because people have been sinning from the day he died, and it hasn't stopped it one bit. But of course, it did have a great impact upon his disciples. And so he took that and was in the Garden of Gethsemane, of course, that he was then arrested. Judas leads the Roman soldiers to where he is praying and where he is staying. And the Roman soldiers come and they arrest him at that point. And of course, they resist, or Peter, the disciples want to resist. Peter, the story goes, he with his sword cut the ear of one of the Roman soldiers, which Christ heals that soldier of his injury, and forbids his disciples from taking up violence like that, and they take him away. But of course, that story that I said, that it's shortly thereafter, seeing that Jesus was taken, the disciples themselves disperse, because they know that the Roman soldiers are probably going to try to capture also those people that were in close association with them. So it says that night, that Peter followed the Roman soldiers to where they were going to take Jesus. And as they were going, a group of children or young people or perhaps some ladies, they come and they say, aren't you the fellow that is a follower of Jesus Christ? And they say this in the presence of the soldiers. And Peter says, no, that not me. And he says, I won't be the one. I'm not him. You must be mistaken. And again, a similar instance happens again. And I'll read this little section out of the Bible where it says that. He says, and when he had gone out of the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. But again, Peter denied with an oath, oh, I do not know the man. And a little later, those who stood up by came and said to Peter, he says, surely you are also one of them, for your speech betrays you. And Peter says, then he began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. And immediately, right after he says that, the cock crows. It's early morning by that time, and the rooster, cock-a-doodle-doo. And Peter remembers that Christ said he would deny him 3 times before the cock crows. And so, as the Bible says very sweetly and or movingly, so he went out and he wept bitterly, because he had thought he would be able to do what Christ had done and stand up for him, but he could not. And so Christ was taken, ultimately. He was taken and held until the day and brought before Pontius Pilate to be judged. Because now the Jews could have judged him in their own religious court, but as a heretic. But the Roman law in those days was that the Jewish court could not convict somebody to death. And the priests wanted to make sure that Jesus was put to death, to, you might say, take care of the trouble. And that could only be done by the Romans. So they brought him to Pilate to be judged, and they leveled all the charges against him. And Pilate wanted to question Jesus, and he does. And he asked Jesus, are you a king, as everybody says? And Jesus says, and he quotes him here, he says, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. Now, he was bearing witness, and not bearing witness by what he did, bearing witness by how he lived, bearing witness by his very vibration, bearing witness to the truth by the very consciousness that he had. But of course, those who were in tune with him could understand that. Those who were not they didn't know what he was saying. But notice he didn't ever say, I am the Messiah, I'm a king. He just said, others say so. He says, they say so, but he wouldn't necessarily take that on for himself. And then Pilate says, what is he, when speaking of Jesus saying he's the truth, he says, what is truth? Now, Master once had a commentary, he says, Pilate asked the wrong question, and for us to take heed of that question, we often ask ourselves, what is truth? What is truth? And we go looking to try to find out the answer of what is truth. He says, that's not the question we as devotees should be asking. It's curiosity. It's not bad to ask that. But the real question is, we need to ask the question, how do I know truth? How do I find truth? How do I understand truth? It's the how-to that is the important question. And of course, that is why the masters have come in this age, to give us the fulfillment of that, how to come to know the truth, something that philosophers throughout the centuries, throughout the ages, have debated what it is. But what is needed now, and it was appropriate now for this age, it's an answer, or answer to the question of how do I find truth? How do I know truth? And of course, in his time, Pilate's time, it didn't occur to him perhaps to even ask that question. So Pilate then basically he says, when he says, what is truth? And then he says this, he goes out to the Jews and says to them, I find no fault in him. You see, he didn't judge him negatively. He didn't find anything wrong with him. And he says that to them. But the crowd is very displeased. And so you could say Pilate, in an for expediency's sakes, gives the crowd a choice. It's once a year he would allow somebody to be pardoned. And so he says, I will pardon Jesus, or Barabbas, another convict who was about to be executed. I will pardon him. Which do you choose? And they chose Barabbas to be pardoned, and the crowd wanted Jesus to be condemned in Barabbas' place. And so Pontius Pilate, he says this. He says, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail, but only caused disturbance, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. And so it's from that incident we've often heard this expression, I wash my hands of the whole affair. I want nothing to do with it. We kind of even go like that. And that's where that comes from. And of course, it is what has condemned Pilate in memory, along with Judas, to be so disliked and dishonored from then forward. But of course, that's what happened. And so Jesus is then scourged and crucified and taken up to the Mount of Olives, and there raised up with a couple of others to be killed or to die on the cross. A very terrible ordeal, but of course, the symbol lives on. And did he suffer in that? Again, this is a big thing. And he obviously felt the pain, and he allowed himself to feel the pain. And to that degree, in a human sense, his human self, yes, he did suffer. I feel your pain, you might say. But we have to remember that through this whole thing, he was a realized master. So the answer is, did he feel pain and suffering? The answer is yes. And the answer is no, in the sense he allowed that to happen. And you have to see it in the light of his mission. It was such an intense drama, and obviously something like that was memorable, and it's been passed down through the centuries, through the millennia now. And so it had a terrible immediate effect upon him and his followers. But in the long term, it acted as that symbol. And you could say we have to understand in that context that really suffering, the word itself, comes when there is ego consciousness. If there is not ego consciousness, you could say, is suffering possible? Or is that person being able to suffer if there's no ego consciousness? And the answer is only if it's allowed. And you could say joy is the fruit. And so on a deep level, joy and suffering is, it's just God's dream. When life is a dream, life is suffering, life is joy, but behind it all, it is a dream suffering. And even if to the degree we experience happiness through the body, it's a dream joy until we have that direct consciousness or that direct experience of God within our own heart. And then to what degree we can choose to put ourselves in the body or to put ourselves outside of a body. But then you could say all of this, which takes place on the Friday, is but a prelude for what the real message of Easter is. You could sort of say you have to have in everything a villain. And you have to, in order to make the success of any good play, the hero has to go through suffering in order to ultimately conquer that which brought about that suffering. And the ultimate victory is represented through the resurrection. And because I don't have enough time to really do resurrection justice, I'm going to put that off until next week, and we'll cover the resurrection and that impact that event had upon the immediacy of the people there, and of course the impact it has had on historically in the years since. But since I do have a little extra time here, I'd like to invite questions or comments if there are some. And then before going on to that very important second half, you might say, of this story of the Easter weekend, which is coming up, by the way, is coming Sunday. So are there any questions? I'm going to look in the chat box here and see if I see something. And I don't. Anyway, I'll give you a moment. But if there's not, I'm going to pick up this story next week. Now, I didn't want to go into the details of the crucifixion because you can read that in the Bible. And if you have interest in this, that's of course what I would recommend you to. Or you could read The Second Coming of Christ, the Master's original, or you could see Swami's book also on the teachings of Master on Jesus Christ. What message can we take from Peter's betrayal? I think that's a good question. I think one is Peter, of course, comes down as you could say, the one Christ gave the keys to the kingdom, and of course took the lead amongst the disciples, not necessarily because he was the most spiritual of them. I would say probably the most mystical one was John, and it's said that John was Christ's favorite. But Peter had a dynamic personality of a leader. And of course, the leaders, there is a tendency, if you're a leader, maybe he was a natural leader, there's a more outward manifestation of one's energy and a warrior mentality, you might say. And eventually, of course, he demonstrates that in his, his leadership of what happens after, and his going, ultimately he goes to Rome, and he was symbolizing, you could say he's, the Peter was the, you might say, the founder of the church in the sense in outwardly that representative. But you could say that he was motivated a little bit. He had a bigger ego a little bit too, because he was that dynamic. He had that sort of personality, and he was biting off more than he can chew. Now, the affirmation was good, and the fact that he would say, "I can follow you, Christ, anywhere. I will." But then put to the test, he fell short. And he didn't realize. But I think the part that strikes me is that part immediately he went out from there and he wept very bitterly, because he came to the self-realization of his own limitations. His devotion and his commitment of those big words was lacking. And I think I take that to heart, because yes, I say I'm gonna drink the whole ocean, but I can only drink 6 glasses. And there's a sense of humility. And I think in that story, I take that aspect of humility that Peter, he saw, yes, I have, he was self-aware, and he was that little bit of ego consciousness that I'm going to do it, was humbled by that. And I think it made him a much stronger devotee. And he then took to heart the job that was going to be before him, to take on this mantle of leadership, to go forward with the disciples. So I see it as a mark of strength. He failed. Or let's say he didn't yet succeed, but he saw that, and he took it to heart, and he said yes. And I thought that was a mark of strength, ultimately, to be for that. That's how I take it. I always admired Peter more for that. And the others didn't say anything. And of course, Peter stood up. He was the one that was ready to go to battle with the Roman soldiers. And Christ says, no, hold on. So he had that natural temperament, but it needed to be humbled a little bit. And I think that's what happened. I think maybe that tendency in all of us a little bit needs to be a little bit humbled. Crucifixions means taking karma. Now, crucifixion, is the word crucifixion is literally, of course, is being put on that cross. But the word itself is taking on a meaning over the centuries since then. To be crucified is to be persecuted, to be unfairly treated. I'm being persecuted. I'm being crucified by my neighbors, next door who aren't nice. So you could see it in that sense. Now, the part about taking on karma, not necessarily, just the fact of being crucified doesn't make you take on karma, because it depends on your consciousness. Now, Christ, of course, a master, can take on the karma of others, because they no longer have karma of their own. They have transcended the ego consciousness, because karma attaches to the ego. So when there's no ego, and something happens to a master who has no ego, does that mean there's no karma? No, there's not. Karma exists in every action. There's action, there's reaction, and there's, on the physical level of Newtonian physics, but on a subtle spiritual level, there's karma. People's hatred of somebody, represented by that crucifixion, there was terrible action. So those who perpetrated that accrued karma. And so consequently, but there's no karma. And so you would say, well, the receiver of that received karma, but there's no ego there to receive the karma. So where does the karma go? You could say the karma, the blessings, you could say that they take on, you could say a master takes onto his physical body and suffers, takes that pain and suffers not because they have karma of their own, but that karma has to go somewhere. So it's the karma, you could say, the benefit of that, of taking that karma and expiating it, can be done. The master is able to transfer the blessings of that, the benefit of that, to his disciples or those people that are in tune with them. How the mechanics of that work, I can't explain that because I'm not of that level of understanding. But that is the tradition, that a great master can take on karma of other people because there's no place for it to land in their own consciousness because they transcended the ego, but they can benefit it, transfer it, or they could say, if not the disciples, to the world at large. And it's to this idea of being able to take on the karma, the world, for the blessings for the world at large. To some degree, it's true, but you cannot take on infinity's future karma in one action like that. To a certain degree, everybody accrues the blessings, but particularly it's those that are close to that person. So he takes on the karma, particularly for those at present in his lifetime. But in a sense, anybody that attunes with the great master also feels to some degree that blessing as well. And why did it say, eat my flesh and drink my blood? I think I covered that in a lesson or in a class or two ago, a couple of weeks ago. If you missed it, you're going to have to go back and catch up on those. I don't want to repeat. What happened to Judas after he betrayed Jesus? Well, of course, Judas in the Bible, he's, again, you should read the Bible. Now, it's not in the Gospels. Many people, when they read the Bible, they read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they don't cover what happened after. You have to read the next book in the Bible, which is called the Acts. And it's a very interesting one because it's more historical. And its tradition says it was composed by Luke. But it was composed a little bit after, and it kind of tells a little bit of the story of what happened after. And that's, in other words, and then what happened, Jesus appearing to the disciples, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, Judas, of course, felt extremely, why, this has been a source of debate for millennia, why did he betray Christ? Obviously, he had terrible misunderstanding and accrued bad karma for that. But he saw Christ, Jesus, in a worldly sense. Maybe he thought Christ would resist and he'd become the physical Messiah predicted by in the book of Isaiah, as the kingdom of Judea would rise again and perhaps free itself from the Romans. Now that revolution that maybe some were looking for through Jesus did happen 70 years later. They did rise up and tried to throw the Romans off. They failed, and that caused the expulsion of the Jews from the Holy Land and 2,000 years of wandering after that. But anyway, Judas, extremely repentant, realizes he made a terrible mistake. And in his grief and repentance, he commits suicide. But, and of course, we know the story that Master said ultimately, of course, during his lifetime, Judas had been reincarnated in the presence or to become a disciple of a different master and was ultimately liberated or freed from all that karma. So that's a hopeful story, because some people think, oh, it's for eternity, he must suffer. But Master says, no, eternity, that's far too, he played his part. It was a negative part, but it's not, nobody can be condemned for eternity. And so can you please recommend a lucid version of the Bible for someone who has not been, yes, you see, I like the old King James Version, and the reason, but its language is difficult for somebody, especially if English is not your first language, because it's Old English, not Old English, it's early English, Shakespearean time English. King James brought together not just scholars, he brought together writers and artists and poets to compose a modern version during his reign, which is about the time of Shakespeare's time, although I don't think Shakespeare was involved in this. But he brought them to make a beautiful translation. And I think it's the wording has a beauty to it. And they went back to the original sources, and it's so in Greek, and did the best job they could for it. Now, some people say it's difficult to read. It's not proper. Maybe its language is outdated. I agree. It all is. But the flow is nice. And when you're brought up with something it's like if you're brought up into Sanskrit, the scriptures are in Sanskrit, well, you sort of like it. And whereas the modern English is so I can't. That's what I'm sort of saying is I can't, because I haven't read very much of the others. I always read the old version, and I realize it's difficult for a person who isn't brought up in that tradition, but it's nicer. That's all I can say. And so I'm sorry, I can't bring it up. Give a recommendation, but let's call it a day for that, and let's come back and I guess I kind of skipped over a lot of stuff in this crucifixion, because it's sort of, to me, it's not the important part of this Easter season. The real important part is the resurrection and the impact that had, and the basic truth. And there's lots to say about that. And so let's come back next week and we'll pick it up at that point. So God bless all of you. And may you have, because before we get together, this coming Friday is Good Friday, and coming Sunday is Easter, and may you have a blessed Easter season and feel Christ in your heart. Joy to all of you.